When players think about unfinished games released in a terrible state, some may look at Halo, the Master Chief Collection, No Man's Sky, the GTA Remaster Trilogy, the last 5 Call of Duty games, but probably the biggest and most culturally impactful game that released as an underbaked mess was Cyberpunk 2077. You really just had to be there during its disastrous release to truly see how angry people were. A game with so much hype and marketing being made by CD Projekt Red, the same developers responsible for the wildly successful and award-winning Witcher franchise. To truly understand, we need to go back in time to 2007 with the release of the first Witcher game. At the time, CD Projekt Red were a mostly unknown Polish company, but they really started to make a name for themselves as they continued to develop the Witcher franchise, leading up to the third Witcher in 2015. By this point, they had solidified themselves as one of the gaming greats. While their games weren't perfect, especially from a technical side, they were very popular and resonated extremely well, with The Witcher 3 Wild Hunt selling over 50 million copies worldwide. Now, it is worth noting that before they even announced The Witcher 3, they had already announced Cyberpunk 2077 in 2012. Though, despite this announcement, the game wouldn't even enter development for another 4 years, as most of the developers were busy working on Wild Hunt. Most of the work done for Cyberpunk at the time was just concept arts and ideas. CD Projekt Red had a lot of work on their hands, as the game was a very big departure from the Witcher franchise in terms of setting, with Wild Hunt being set in 1272, while Cyberpunk 2077 being set in, 2077. This meant that a lot of the assets they'd worked on for The Witcher would have to be rebuilt from the ground up. Cyberpunk would also have to be built for a whole new generation of consoles, whilst also having to accommodate for last gen and a PC release. This would prove to be a significant challenge during development, as a lot of the visuals in the game were very hardware demanding, which last gen struggled immensely with. The gap in visual fidelity between these consoles grew over time, and it was pretty clear with the eventual release that CD Projekt Red likely had given up on it during a certain point in development. But that will come later. Just know that coming off The Witcher set in a medieval fictional European town to a Blade Runner-esque futuristic setting was not an easy transition. This was also their first time making a first-person game with character customization, vehicles, and much more. This was not at all helped by the development time being reduced to only 4 years, as opposed to Wild Hunt's 5 years. Which, let's not forget, Wild Hunt was actually a relatively buggy launch, despite this being the genre CD Projekt Red had been developing for close to a decade. Despite this, they were going out of their way to market the game as if it was going to be the next GTA. All this crazy hype for the game only heightened the already high expectations for it to deliver, especially with how much they were just glazing the game. Instead of letting the game speak for itself, they just had to let us know how great it was.
We've greatly enhanced our crowd and community system to create the most believable city in any open-world game to date.
CD Projekt Red were under immense pressure to showcase Cyberpunk early to the public in this marketing hype campaign. However, the game was in such an unfinished state at this time that CD Projekt Red would have to dedicate time to create a build of the game that was pretty much fake, designed for the sole purpose of showcasing it to the public. It was basically false advertisement that perhaps represented an ideal of what they wanted the game to be, not being indicative of the final product. All this time would have been better spent actually working on the game, bringing it closer to what can only be described as a vision of what Cyberpunk could be. The studio heads were more focused on projecting an image of Cyberpunk 2077 to get as many purchases as possible, instead of actually focusing on making the game as great as it could possibly be. Wowing the fans and press was too high of a priority, especially when you compare it to Rockstar's GTA. They hype their upcoming games too, but not to such an extent, because they know that regardless, people are going to buy whatever they make. This was also the case with Cyberpunk. The game was practically gonna sell itself. They really didn't need such an elaborate marketing campaign. All they needed to do was buckle down and focus on creating the game itself. With this in mind, it should come as no surprise that there was a lot of heavy crunching during the development of Cyberpunk. If you don't know, crunching is where developers will often be heavily encouraged or forced to work extra long hours to get as much work done as possible in a short span of time. This often is done to meet a deadline or just speed up production at the expense of the employees. While CD Projekt Red initially came out saying that a crunch would not be necessary, they would soon end up pressuring employees to crunch not long after saying this. The main problem with crunching is when you force someone to work for 12 hours straight. Sure, on paper you get more work done, but probably around that 8-hour mark and after it, they become more liable to make mistakes that could result in glitches, bugs, etc. The main thing Cyberpunk suffered from. The co-CEO of CD Projekt Red even came out saying that the crunch was quote-unquote not that bad. He would later have to apologize for this comment, but it was clear that Cyberpunk was not a game made under happy and healthy working conditions. There was a major disconnect between different parts of the company during Cyberpunk's development. Multiple post-launch reports and developer testimonies revealed that the studio struggled with communication, unrealistic timelines, and divided priorities between departments. Developers repeatedly warned leadership that the timeline was unrealistic, but management insisted on a 2020 release to satisfy investors after years of hype. A Bloomberg investigation by Jason Schreier reported that some developers didn't believe the game would be ready until 2022, but upper management pushed forward anyway. Leadership presentations painted an overly optimistic picture to investors, while internally, teams were scrambling to make basic systems functional. Not to mention the fact that the game was being built on an engine that was still being developed as they were working, leading to technical miscommunication and broken tools. You had situations where some departments were designing features that other teams couldn't yet implement. As mentioned, the last-gen consoles Xbox One and PS4 simply weren't up to what was being asked of them with Cyberpunk. The highly detailed city and graphics were designed with next-gen in mind, whereas they would have to downgrade a lot of this to give the older versions a chance. However, it wasn't as simple of a case as just lowering certain textures and shadows. Cyberpunk, for the time, was among one of the most visually ambitious games ever, and CD Projekt Red would have to do a lot more to make these versions function. There was even a consideration made towards just scrapping the last-gen ports. Some engineers urged leadership to cut the last-gen versions entirely, or delay them much longer, because the engine simply couldn't handle the scale of the game on 2013 hardware. However, management refused to consider cancelling them, since those consoles still represented the majority of the player base in 2020, leaving CD Projekt Red in a position where they had to dedicate time to these inferior versions, whilst the next gen would directly suffer as a result. Since the game started production in 2016, PS4 and Xbox One were the lead platforms for most of the development, meaning everything from city density to streaming distance to asset size had to fit inside 8GB of RAM. Since the game started production in 2016, PS4 and Xbox One were the lead platforms for most of development, meaning everything from city density to streaming distance to asset size had to fit inside 8GB of RAM. It was a really hard situation as Cyberpunk released like a month after the PS5, which, well, if you remember, getting your hands on a PS5 during those early days was not easy. So there's no way they could have feasibly disregarded the last gen versions unless they were to delay the game a year or more, which was not an option. And so if you didn't think it could get bad enough, then there was the virus. This was the absolute last thing the already very pressured developers needed. Cyberpunk's development at the time was in a very fragile state. CD Projekt Red had to move hundreds of developers to work from home almost overnight. The company had no established remote dev infrastructure. Builds were stored on secure internal servers that weren't accessible from outside. As a result, build syncing slowed down to a crawl. Uploading a new version of the game from home could take many hours. Testing became fragmented as QA couldn't simply walk to another desk to verify a bug fix or share footage. Having to work from home wasn't as simple as just bringing your laptop back from the office. Many development roles required equipment that was just not fit or simply couldn't be brought outside of the headquarters for security reasons. CD Projekt Red would be forced to delay the game 3 times in 2020. Its initial release date was intended for April 16th of 2020, but would end up releasing on the 10th of December. The problem is that upper management were so focused on getting the game out in 2020 to capitalize on the new gen hype, when in reality, they should have done what GTA 6 is currently doing by delaying the game by a whole year, rather than multiple delays spanning just a few months. And you best believe that in those few months, there was a whole lot of crunchy crunch going on to resolve as many issues as possible, yet sadly, they could only do so much before its release. And thus came the most infamous launch in gaming history. Within just hours, console players started posting clips of massive bugs and performance issues, T-posing NPCs, cars exploding, low-resolution textures, and game-breaking crashes. Footage spread quickly on Reddit and Twitter, shocking players who had expected the game to look like the sleek demos. No matter what platform you were on, there were tons of glitches and broken features. However, this was especially noticeable on the last gen ports, which were quite literally unplayable. There was an endless amount of compilations made of the game's technical faults. Just 2 days after release, CD Projekt Red posted an open letter to players saying that if they are unhappy with the game on their console, they can opt for a refund. However, they made the statement before consulting Sony or Microsoft, who actually handled digital sales, so when players tried to claim refunds through the PS Store or Xbox Store, most were denied at first. Sony was absolutely furious that CD Projekt Red had spoken for them without approval. On December 17th, Sony took the drastic step of removing Cyberpunk 2077 from the PlayStation Store entirely, the first time a AAA game had been delisted due to quality issues. Microsoft would follow shortly after, announcing that anyone who bought the game digitally could get a full refund, even if they had played the game for several hours. This was likely a huge punch in the gut for all parties involved. Right after launch, CD Projekt Red entered what was called a crisis recovery mode. Developers were working around the clock from home to fix the game. There would be 3 separate hotfixes over the course of December, with the first one being dropped just 48 hours after launch, with most of the hotfixes being targeted at the last gen console releases. According to CD Projekt Red's 2020 financial report and investor calls, around 30,000 refunds were processed directly through CD Projekt Red's own program. This cost the company about 2.17 million USD. But this doesn't include refunds handled by Sony, Microsoft, Steam, or other retailers, so the true total was likely significantly higher, possibly several 100,000 copies. The refund controversy became a major focus of investor lawsuits against CD Projekt Red, accusing them of misleading the public and investors about the game's state. Sony didn't allow Cyberpunk 2077 back on the PS Store until June of 2021, over 6 months later, a huge black mark for the studio's reputation. When it finally returned, CD Projekt Red advised players to not play on the base PS4s until further optimization. In January 2021, the co-founder released a public video apologizing to players. He admitted, "We underestimated the task, the console versions were below our quality standards, and the responsibility lies with me and the board."
Based on that legacy of genuine and honest communication, you've trusted us and pre-ordered our game. And despite good reviews on PC, the console version of Cyberpunk 2077 did not meet the quality standard we wanted it to meet. I and the entire leadership team are deeply sorry for this, and this video is me publicly owning up to that. Please don't fault any of our teams for what happened. They all are incredibly talented and hardworking. Myself and the board are the final decision makers, and it was our call to release the game. Although, believe me, we never ever intended for anything like this to happen.
He promised to fix the game rather than abandon it, which helped soften some public anger. CD Projekt Red formed strike teams dedicated solely to PS4 and Xbox optimization. They introduced cross-department bug meetings, ensuring that every major issue was tracked daily. They shifted from a feature-first mindset to a stability-first one, essentially reversing the studio's creative philosophy. However, while this was probably the right decision, it made it so that CD Projekt Red had to push back the content they had planned for the game to much later in 2021, as their focus was first on making the game functional. In doing this, they created a content drought that lasted multiple months, which wasn't exactly ideal for retaining a strong player base. Similar to Battlefield 2042, Cyberpunk was a game that spent the first and most important chunk of its lifespan fixing issues that shouldn't have been there in the first place, instead of adding content to keep players engaged. While games like Destiny and No Man's Sky were able to recover from their bad launches, a lot of that can be contributed to those games' online multiplayer, which helped prolong player interest over an extended time. Cyberpunk, on the other hand, while having planned an online multiplayer, was ultimately cancelled after the very disastrous release. And if the game ran this bad in single player, I just can't imagine how bad it would be in multiplayer. CD Projekt Red had obviously planned for Cyberpunk to go on for years and years. It was going to be their GTA, but that never came to be. However, it wasn't all negative. As the game went on, it definitely grew and improved. In September of 2022, Netflix released the Cyberpunk Edge Runners anime. This really boosted the player count beyond what they were probably expecting. The game went from around 10 to 20k concurrent players on Steam to over 1 million across all platforms. This was a massive success for CD Projekt Red after a long streak of failures. In September of 2023, they would release the Phantom Liberty DLC. This DLC would feature a new storyline featuring Idris Elba, a new district, as well as overhauls of various in-game systems. Across the board, it was a very well-received DLC. This would mark the end of any major content releases for the game, as it was now classified as content complete. In November 2024, the company reported that sales of Cyberpunk 2077 had exceeded 30 million copies, with the Phantom Liberty expansion having sold over 8 million copies. Early in 2025, CD Projekt Red announced that the full game, base plus Phantom Liberty, would launch on the Nintendo Switch 2 on June 5th as the Ultimate Edition. They also revealed that the sequel, codenamed Cyberpunk 2, had officially entered pre-production with 96 plus developers working on it as of April/May 2025. In the end, Cyberpunk 2077's journey is one of gaming's biggest redemption arcs. What began in 2020 as one of the most disastrous launches in modern history, plagued by bugs, broken last-gen versions, and crushed expectations, slowly transformed into the immersive RPG that CD Projekt Red had originally promised. Through years of patches, the Edge Runner anime, and finally the 2.0 overhaul with Phantom Liberty, the game rebuilt its reputation from the ground up. By 2024 to 2025, Cyberpunk had gone from a meme to a modern classic, selling over 30 million copies, winning awards, and leaving behind a legacy of lessons learned in transparency, ambition, and recovery. CD Projekt Red ultimately proved that redemption is possible, but it takes time, humility, and commitment to fixing what was broken. With the sequel estimated for a late 2020s release year, hopefully we can see CD Projekt Red learn from their mistakes and create the type of game they wish they made with the first Cyberpunk. But that's all for this video, thanks for watching. Also, I'm live on Twitch daily, so if you're interested, come follow.